Hi everybody. Today I'm here to talk to you about Neo-Romanticism and the return to tonal music after this long period of atonality and integral serialism and complicated styles of music. So we're going to listen to some things, you're going to answer some questions, and it should be a fairly rewarding lesson. Let's get started. Now, in the mid to late 20th century, if you were a serious composer, the common language was to write atonal music. The only problem with this for a lot of composers was that they found it difficult to get their works performed. They would get them premiered, but then people wouldn't want to listen to them again in a lot of cases. So some composers decided they wanted to appeal to a wider audience, and one way to do that was to make a return to tonality. Okay, so we're going to talk about a composer named David del Tredici, one of the first to make this plunge back into tonality. He started out writing atonal music, but then when he encountered the work of Lewis Carroll and he was writing music about Alice in Wonderland and her adventures in 1975, he decided the best way to do this was to use tonal music. This may seem non-controversial to us, but at the time this is a very radical move for a university composer to be making. This particular work is scored for an amplified soprano who narrates a story and sings some arias, and an extended orchestra that includes folk instruments like the banjo, mandolin, accordion, and so on. But overall, the music is tonal sounding. It sounds sometimes folk-like, it sounds sometimes more romantic, like the style of Strauss or Mahler. And at first, Tredici was afraid that he would offend his university composers' friends who would feel that he had betrayed them and gone commercial. This was not something that anyone was encouraging to write tonal music. It felt almost like a step backwards rather than forwards. But ultimately, as a composer, he renounced this modernist idea of progress. That music always has to change and progress, and you can't go back to previous styles. And he embraced tonality as a valid compositional option, something that composers can choose. Okay, so pause the lesson here, listen to two examples in the quiz, and then come back. Okay, welcome back. We've talked in the past about neoclassicism, which was something Stravinsky was involved with. So composers were looking back at some points in the 20th century, but I want to point out that classicism is more of an objective type of composition, not as emotional, not as expressive in an emotional way. So composers in the latter part of the 20th century have now started to write in what we call a neo-romantic style, which is embracing the emotions of late 19th century music. In particular, composers ranging from late Beethoven to Brahms and Mahler in style, and embracing again the emotional aspect of that. First composer that we see kind of doing this is George Rochberg. He was the chair of composition at, I think, University of Pennsylvania, and he was a proponent of serial music. He had written serial music all his life. But when his son died of a brain tumor in 1964, he found that he could no longer express what he wanted to be able to express with this musical language. It couldn't convey the emotions that he was feeling. So he started to explore, and he began to write music more in the style of these romantic composers, Beethoven and Schubert and Mahler and Berg. The first piece that did this was his third string quartet in 1972. I'm going to have you listen to a movement from the fifth string quartet in 1978 to see how this was really in the style of Beethoven. He was, again, kind of controversial in that he was looking back and using a previous style of music, something that wasn't, allowed for from the viewpoint of modernism, where music has to progress forward. And he wasn't even, unlike the neoclassicists, he wasn't putting a 20th century twist on it. It wasn't an ironic look from a 20th century lens on the music of the past. He was really embracing these styles from the past and writing music in the style of Beethoven in a non-ironic way. So this is another direction that composers are taking now. And in fact, some composers said this opened up the gates for them, whereas before they said, well, if George Rochberg can do this, then if he can write in the style of Beethoven, then I can write in the style of Brahms and not feel guilty about it. I can take on these styles from the past and just write new music in those styles. I'm not copying them or imitating them as much as writing new music that adopts those styles of the past. So pause the video here and listen to a bit of the string quartet number 5. So another development of the late 20th century is that we're starting to see more and more very successful female composers. In previous centuries, aspects of culture didn't allow them to publish their music or to become well-known as composers, except in a few very well-known cases, like Clara Schumann. But Ellen Taft-Zweilich is a very well-known composer. She studied at Florida State, then she went on to Juilliard, where she was the first woman in 1975 to earn a DMA in composition. She studied there with well-known serial composers Elliott Carter and Roger Sessions. Then in 1979, after her husband died, she wanted to change her style of composition to something that could communicate better with performers and listeners more directly. And this is sort of a change from her previous, a little more harsh and jagged style of writing. This resulted in her 1982 Symphony No. 1, which won for her the Pulitzer Prize in musical composition. She's the first woman to win that prize. This uses tonal centers. The themes are developed in a traditional way, the sorts of things that would be happening in romantic style music, and she's become known as another neo-romantic composer. So pause the video here and listen to the first movement of this symphony and answer the question. Okay, welcome back. This is now the final part of the video, and we've already talked about John Adams before in terms of post-minimalism, but also his music contains the strong element of neo-romanticism. And I want to look in particularly at his piece Harmony Lyra, which is named after a music theory treatise by Arnold Schoenberg, actually. He says that this piece was inspired by a dream that he had during which he was crossing the Oakland Bay Bridge, and he saw an oil tanker there in the water that abruptly turned upright and took off in the sky like a Saturn V rocket. This dream somehow ended an 18-month writer's block that he had been experiencing, and he wrote this symphony. I'm going to have you listen to the second movement, which is the most neo-romantic of the three movements. It's in the style of Mahler or Sibelius. The outer movements have more of the minimalist processes that he uses, but this middle movement is very broody and emotional, and it's based on an ancient legend called the Fisher King, who is the last of the knights to guard the Holy Grail. And while he's doing this, he's wounded, and he spends the rest of his life fishing. That's all he's able to do. waiting for someone to come and ask him a particular question that will heal him. So that's a medieval legend, and you can sort of think of that as you listen to this movement. Okay, so this is your introduction to Neo-Romanticism. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and make sure to answer the last question and submit your answers. Thanks, bye.